The conscience is a meddlesome companion.
How superstitious are you?
Do you believe in the power of a curse? How do you describe terror?
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me this evening in our latest video. Have you ever wondered if you're really in control? Some say they have it together, that everything in their life is under their complete control. It's cute, not knowing what lies beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Because the truth is, none of us are in control. Well, I mean, none of you are in control. I'm Bob the Pet Ferret, and when you're an interdimensional being like me, you can see through the veil and manipulate it. A video game, released in August last year, attempts to lift that veil for the general populace, and for its efforts, I awarded it my Game of the Year. It follows the story of a woman named Faden as she enters a strange, hidden government building in the hopes of finding her brother. But how exactly did it build a narrative around the realities that exist beyond ours? And how did it sell its fiction so effectively as a world, no matter how weird it got? I mean, assuming that you think it's fiction, at least. Today, we're going to be examining how to world build when your world appears to make no sense. And while we try to wrap our heads around this, please try not to lose the plot. My asylum is quite full already, thank you.
Did I lose you there for a moment?
The Federal Bureau of Control is central to the story of Control. Aside from their name partly providing the title of the game, all events of the story take place in their offices, and they're the source of Jesse's motivations. But who are they, and how does the game help us understand who they are? Shadowy government agencies are nothing new to fiction, thanks to the disturbing activities of the CIA during the Cold War, the fact that the FBI was founded by a paranoid nut, and the endless mystery surrounding Area 51. It's no surprise that the US government agencies have attracted a lot of stories about what's really going on in the seats of power. Science fiction has also been a huge source of this, with media such as, well, the X-Files, kind of the obvious one. And this is definitely specific to US agencies, as the UK equivalent of the CIA, MI5, is better known for suave men in tuxedos drinking martinis. More appropriately, the equivalent agency in developer Remedy's home country of Finland, Supo, returned basically no results for fictional representations, so clearly there's zero mystique surrounding them. On the surface, the FBC is your typical fictional government agency of mystery. The director is a man in a suit smoking grumpily in the shadows. The building is littered with files talking about protocols that must be upheld at all costs. The building is an imposing presence looming over New York like a malevolent and caring god. Indeed, in Jesse's backstory, they exist as these agencies normally do in fiction. An incident happens, they swoop in, cover everything up, and remove all evidence, up to and including kidnapping children.
We took him in.
As we learn more about Jessie's history, we learn that she's been monitored her whole adult life by men in the shadows. This setup leads to a stark contrast when we go to the Bureau proper. The cliché shadowy smoking man turns up dead, and now Jessie is the director, an attractive young redhead in a leather jacket. Her first interaction with Bureau staff outside of the janitor paints a picture completely unlike the public perception, which she acknowledges when meeting Emily Pope.
Emily Pope. I don't know her, but I like her already. She's the opposite of the faceless agency I've blamed for what happened to me for so long.
This shattering of the typical image of a shadowy bureau continues. Jessie meets Simon Arish, an equally affable security head who's stern upon first meeting her, but softens when he learns of her new role. Langston is significantly less charming, but his talk of employee benefits and the way he sees his job, he hardly comes across as a scheming figure. And then there's Dr. Darling, who we only see in videos on projectors and VHS recordings, who is central to the scientific research of the facility, but is ultimately a goofy nerd rather than someone sinister. Similarly, throughout the game there is more than enough evidence that shows bureau staff are just office workers with the usual office politics and drudgery found in any other place of work. Memos complain about people not doing their jobs, reminders of after-work poker games, awkward attempts at igniting an office romance, notice boards filled with trivial everyday notices, characters joking around like this.
Do you think we should tell him about the mermaid? Excuse me? Yeah, the mermaid. Horowitz here found this mermaid in a quarry just sitting on some black rock. She was singing this beautiful song, and he was overcome with desire.
Did you tell your CO about this?
No, because it didn't happen.
Fuck you guys.
It all paints an intensely mundane picture of an agency that Jessie has viewed as sinister her whole life. It's a fascinating bit of world building. Remedy took that typical secretive government agency imagery and asked the simple question, what would it actually be like working there? And the thing is, I'm sure real-life civil servants would paint a picture similar to the games, if they were allowed to talk about their jobs publicly. What's great about this is that it establishes how important and far-reaching the Bureau's work is, while keeping it grounded and keeping it humanized. We end up liking the staff, so we end up wanting to be part of this world. Emily in particular does much of the groundwork as she acts as Jessie's unofficial second in command. She gets Jessie up to speed on things she needs to know, suggests appropriate actions to take in various situations, and shows a genuine joy and excitement in her work that's hard not to find charming. If the game had stuck rigidly to the shadowy government agents typically seen in fiction, it would have been hard to really invest in everything else that's going on. By making the office feel relatable, even amongst all the weird work they do, it gives us an anchor to reality and a reason to try and rid this place of the threat that's befallen them. But what exactly is their work?
Who cares if you fail your clairvoyance test? Maybe your brain can throw baseballs or talk to dead people and make friends blind.
The FBC has one role: to secure and contain items and incidents outside our understanding of reality in order to protect us all. The building contains a prison, known as the Panopticon, where objects of power and altered items are stored and monitored to ensure they don't inflict damage on the populace. Agents are frequently sent out to incidents that happen outside the building to cover up the events and restore normality. If you spent any degree of time on the indie horror portions of the internet, this concept probably sounds familiar to you, as it's the same premise as the SCP Foundation, a website devoted to weird items, events, places, and people who are weird, off-kilter, or even outright dangerous. This can vary from benign entities like the Tickle Monster to deadly viruses like the Clockwork Virus. Remedy have admitted the SCP Foundation was a major influence on Control.
And just the SCP site, the Secure, Contain, Protect site, I don't know if you guys know about that. It was an influence on our game. Like when you
boy does it show. Files throughout the game on the altered items directly resemble the entries on the SCP website, listing containment procedures before descriptions, and addendums to those files are almost always written with the same tone as the addendums of the Foundation. The frequent redactions and missing information take on the same darkly comic feel of the Foundation's common phrase, data expunged. Several SCPs seem to have been modified to fit into Control's world to become objects of power or altered items. SCP-173, the original entry, is functionally similar to the Fridge altered item. The complex mirror universe of SCP-93 seems to have been simplified down to the Mirror altered item. SCP-246 has some possible influence on the main game's key item, the slide projector, or an altered item from the first major story DLC, the movie camera. It should be noted that the DLC was entitled The Foundation, which has caused me no end of confusion in particular when thinking about them together. The movie camera also bears a similar effect to SCP-24's side effect of producing recorded media of the incident it causes. The SCP Foundation is a hell of a journey that I recommend that you go visit sometime if you haven't already, but the altered items of Control are more than just a rip-off. While the SCPs are just weird stuff, mostly stemming from the Sightmere community effort spun off from the creepypasta communities of the internet, Control's altered items have an explanation, and in order to understand that, we need to look at psychoanalyst Carl Jung and his work on the collective unconscious. Jung proposed the idea of the collective unconscious to explain various patterns of behaviour across humanity. He suggested that certain behaviours and beliefs are deeply held within the subconscious and passed on through our genes. He used this to not only explain things like phobias, where someone is afraid of a creature that doesn't exist in the part of the world where they live, but it's also used to explain symbolism and archetypes that exist across vastly different cultures all around the world. The concept isn't new to video games. Assassin's Creed takes the genetic memory concept of this idea to its logical extreme, with machines that can dig through your DNA to allow you to relive memories of your ancestors. The Persona series not only uses Jungian concepts, but is explicitly named after one, and the collective unconscious is explicitly referenced in Persona 5. Just as explicitly as Persona, Control mentions Jung frequently in its files. His theory of synchronicity gets a whole file to itself, while the collective unconscious is brought up as the reason why altered items even exist in the first place. In this case, the collective unconscious isn't just a kind of genetic memory, it's a wider concept that suggests that under the right conditions, our thoughts can shape the reality around us. Our thoughts give altered items their power, and their properties stem from archetypes and commonly understood concepts. One example given, and partly redacted, appears to be a pair of scissors with vampiric properties, just drawing from our collective understanding of what a vampire is. And this is where things get kind of meta, because if that's the explanation, why do so many of the altered items resemble SCPs if they're supposed to be drawing from collective archetypes? Now obviously you could just say, well, that's where they got the inspiration. But let's dig a little deeper on this, shall we? Because the SCP Foundation is a community-driven project. It's one of the most democratic creative projects in existence, in fact, because anyone can contribute and anyone can modify someone's submission for clarity, to add elements or to correct spelling and grammar mistakes, all to make this big collective work. The contents of the Foundation's archives are assembled by amateur writers throwing all their big ideas in a big collective pot. It is, in its own way, a kind of collective unconscious. The ideas and creativity of many, usually anonymous contributors, all meshing together under a single style sheet, is the kind of modern essence of storytellers on opposite sides of the world, telling a tale about a brave hero battling a dangerous animal for glory. And because altered items gain their power from thoughts and feelings of a community, it's likely that the world of Control draws from the collective creative energy of the SCP Foundation and makes the items real in that world. This also explains why they're so distinct from SCPs. Just like how myths modified according to cultural beliefs, the altered items took bits and pieces of the SCP details and modified them to their purpose. This is why altered items are such a compelling narrative element to Control. They draw inspiration from a collective creative source that's equal parts nightmare-inducing and darkly comic. It brings that feel into the game, making you laugh, while the metaphysical ramifications of basically everything are terrifying. Tying it all to Jungian psychology lends it a weird legitimacy, and manages to bridge the gap between the general weirdness of the items and the mundane office politics of the Bureau itself.
I'm drawing the pyramid.
Control's weirdness doesn't just come from the altered items, however. Much of it comes from its central location, the oldest house. A towering, brutal skyscraper hidden in plain sight in New York City, the oldest house is a building that defies explanation. Functionally, it's much like a TARDIS from Doctor Who. Its interior dimensions are vastly larger than its exterior, and it filters itself out of existence despite being visible in plain sight.
I know what it's like. It's like when you fancy someone and they don't even know you exist.
The visuals of the oldest house are striking, taking inspiration from brutalist government buildings such as the FBI's headquarters and, most notably, New York's own Long Lines building. The oldest house stands as a vast concrete monolith. Inside, the brutalist imagery is retained, as much of the office's corridors and vast open spaces are made out of blocks of grey, featureless concrete. Aside from the TARDIS-like supernatural elements, the building also frequently shifts, with corridors changing and rooms switching places. And this is most notable right at the start of the game, where your route consists of a loop around a set of offices that leads right back to where you started, only now your original route is blocked, and an elevator now exists where one previously didn't. The hiss, the villainous resonance that marks the game's main threat, have also exploited the shifting ability to twist rooms into unfathomable shapes. The funny thing is, I thought that those unfathomable shapes were a corruption of the rigid brutalist style. But in fact, these corrupted areas seem heavily inspired by the likes of the Bank of Georgia, the Wetruba Church in Vienna, the Geisel Library in California, Habitat 67 in Montreal, and, most familiar to me, the Barbican Estate in London. Hell, even the in-game map vaguely resembles the official Barbican maps in an alarming way that I never spotted until researching this video. Whether intentionally or not, it's not hard to see the comparison there. The game revels in these kinds of abstract concrete shapes, which are a tastier visual feast than you'd expect masses of grey concrete to be. Even the colour palette of this design is essential to making this game's world work. It grounds the place as a dull, boring office, but allows the weirder elements within the building to stand out with a stark contrast. This is most notable in the hiss-corrupted areas, where the deep red stands out against the grey, and sends a clear signal of danger to the player. It's actually genuinely impressive how essential this art design is to the story, because nothing communicates the weirdness of everything that's happened as quickly as a rigid hallway twisted into a spiral, or concrete blocks sliding around each other like they're fluid. But there's more to the oldest house than just its architectural inspirations, particularly in where the building actually came from. Files throughout the game make it clear the building was found, not built, and not a lot is understood about its inherently supernatural nature, but there are enough clues to point to its origins, and those clues paint a fascinating picture. Remember how I talked about Jungian archetypes crossing between mythologies in vastly different cultures? But that kind of comes into play here and presents the clearest link between the game and its developer's country of origin. As mentioned earlier, Remedy are not an American company, despite writer Sam Lake hiding behind a more English-sounding name, and his face being most notable as the all-American Max Payne. His real name, Sami Jarvi, clearly points to his origins in Finland. Finland is not a country I admit to having much familiarity with, but some online research points to a lesser-known version of Norse mythology baked into its culture, and that's surprisingly relevant for us here. Because one famous element of Norse mythology is Yggdrasil, the world tree that provides a link to the 9 worlds, with Midgard at its centre. It's a midway point between dimensions, allowing passage from one to another. The oldest house also does that same thing. It provides connections to dimensions outside our own, most notably the astral plane, which houses the mysterious board, an interdimensional entity that chews the director of the FBC and communicate directly to Jesse throughout the game. The idea that the oldest house is a world tree sounds odd, but it is a prominent one. It's unlikely to be Yggdrasil itself, but other European cultures, including Finland, believed in the existence of a tree that connected the worlds. So it's very likely that New York also has its own tree. It sounds absurd to call this concrete behemoth a tree, but it checks out when you piece the clues together. The building shifts make sense if you believe the building is a living entity that continues to grow. The oldest house's function as a dimensional portal doesn't just access the astral plane, but it connects to a mysterious quarry under an alien night sky, and a motel that endlessly changes its contents, but not its layout. And later in the game, we seek out the janitor Ahti's help, and near him we discover the markings of a tree on a pillar. The Foundation DLC uses this tree as a portal into the deep caves that make up the building foundation, as the name suggests, and down there, crystals burst from the ground in shapes that aren't that far off the oldest house's stark grey corridors. Combine this with Finland's traditional belief in a 3-tier world, the land of the gods, the material realm, and the land of the dead or underworld, and this checks out further with the oldest house acting as the pillar to tie these layers together. The astral plane, which houses the godlike board, is the land of the gods. New York is the material realm. And the network of caves in the Foundation sure seems like it could be some kind of underworld, or perhaps maybe the quarry fulfills this role, particularly as it's reached by going downward. We don't really get enough information about either of these places for that to really stick, but they seem likely. But the mythology theme actually ties in with Ahti himself. Ahti is a weird Lynchian character who spouts Finnish sayings and talks in riddles, and while this is initially presented as him being a bit of an oddball, it quickly becomes obvious there's something more than just a little foreign weirdness to him. Namely, he directly responds to one of Jesse's internal monologues.
Ahti the janitor is a friendly face in my book.
Better than somebody with no face at all.
Oh, and he does it later again too.
But first, we need to get you working. Very small, couple of hours job.
Something tells me it's gonna be more than that.
You think there's a dog buried in this?
When he takes a vacation later in the game, which in itself is odd considering the building is in lockdown, he does so by disappearing through a wall, diverts through the quarry, and we find him deep in the foundation of the building, holidaying in a hallucinatory depiction of a Finnish riverside cabin. Here he hands Jessie a Walkman to aid her through the next leg of her journey, and then vanishes. Who is Ahti? The magical river may actually be a hint, as Ahti is actually the name of a Finnish deity associated with water. It's likely with all the clues surrounding him, his apparent omniscience, his oddness in communicating, his affinity with water, that he may literally be this Finnish deity, for some reason living within the roots of this world tree in New York. At the beginning of the game he also talks as if she's set to become his assistant, and later on he continues to talk to her as if she is his assistant. But of course, rank-wise, she's higher than him as she's become the new director, and not a janitorial intern. But if you think of it differently, and you think of him as a deity who oversees the oldest house as his domain, Jessie as director is essentially his representative in the material realm. In other words, you are very much his assistant. I mean, it certainly explains why he can take a vacation late in the game, as Jessie is settling into her role. And he says as much in, I think it was a vision? It's a weird game, trust me, anyway. But what about that Walkman? Well, it's required to progress through an ever-shifting environment called the ashtray maze, named for an object of power bound to form a directed trench that creates an environment that can't normally be passed through without the bound person's permission. You can find it midway through the game, and you can do exactly nothing with it. But once you get Ahti's Walkman... yeah, it contains a rockin' tune that pumps Jessie up enough that she can force her way through. Or is it that simple? Not quite, because we're not actually done with mythology. Yeah, really. You see, that track also has some very explicit mythological connections, and it also connects the game to a certain other famous title from Remedy. In Alan Wake, there's mention of a band called the Old Gods of Asgard, a heavy rock band fronted by the Anderson brothers, who Alan meets during the course of the story, and at one point he defends a constant stage from attack while one of their songs blasts out. I may have gotten some of these details wrong because I haven't played Alan Wake, but that's what I found out, so bear with me. In the background of the game, it's heavily implied that the Anderson brothers may literally be Odin and Thor, two powerful and quite well-known Norse gods, with other members of the band including Balder and Loki. The band's name may have been a tip-off to that, because they literally called themselves the Old Gods of Asgard. When Ahti hands Jessie the Walkman back in control, he says it's a gift from friends. And it doesn't seem that odd that one Scandinavian deity might know one or two others. But because the song exists in the world, the nature of the song's lyrics mean that it couldn't possibly exist in that world, because the lyrics are explicitly about the game and Jessie herself, someone who doesn't know the band at all. It's quite possible that the track itself holds godlike powers, which also explains why Jessie can move through the maze. So everything I've talked about so far may feel like a bizarre mixture of disparate elements, but ultimately every weird aspect of Control exists as a way to make sense of the bizarre aspects of reality that surround us. Mythology was an attempt to understand the meaning of life and death in a world with limited scientific understanding. Jungian psychology was a series of theories designed to understand the inner workings of the human mind. Shadowy government conspiracies create stories and try and make sense around questionable decisions taken by political administrations. And the rise of crowdsourced internet horror is the modern form of urban legends. Stories that have always historically been designed to help us shape our fears and anxieties, and to try and make sense of them. Every single theory and story concocted with the intention of helping us understand ourselves and the weirder aspects of the world around us. And perhaps not only to understand it, but as the song says, they're a way to take control. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the theme of the game is control. It's in the title, it's in the name of the Bureau, and it's central to Jessie's story. The story is a simple one. She was wrapped up in a Bureau operation in 2002 when she was 11 years old and her brother Dylan was 10. As we discover throughout the game, particularly when she heads into the sector dedicated to the incident, she and her friends discovered a mysterious slide projector that opened up doors to other dimensions. And here, they let in two entities. The first, a benign one that Jessie names Polaris, is a positive force and travels with Jessie throughout the game, represented as a green spiral pattern that flashes on screen at appropriate points. The second is a malevolent one and the game's main threat. The Hiss, represented by a red oily pattern throughout the game, has the capacity to possess and manipulate those it comes into contact with. Polaris has the power to stop the Hiss through Jessie, and this takes the form of fighting off Hiss-infected agents and cleansing areas of the oldest house from the Hiss's influence. But what happened after the Hiss emerged from the slide projector in 2002? The Bureau files are vague on the details, but all the adults in the town disappear, and the FBC roll in to solve the problem. Dylan is taken away while Jessie escapes. She then spends the next 17 years of her life searching for her brother, racked with guilt and trauma, in and out of dead-end jobs and frequently seeing therapists over her paranoia that she's been watched. In essence, her life is out of her control, and she believes that someone is out to try and control her. At the start of the game, Jessie stumbles into the role of director thanks to Polaris' guidance and passing the tests assigned by the board. She resists the position at first, despite everyone around her taking to her being in charge almost instantly. The oldest house itself even shifts to make her position so entrenched that portraits of her immediately materialise throughout the building after the board appoint her. As the game goes on, she has one goal: to rescue Dylan and go back to a normal life. But as the events unfold, Jessie gets more involved and it becomes obvious Dylan is too far gone from his corruption to be rescued, and her focus changes. She discovers that Polaris has been contained deep within the building and sets out to free her. Upon doing so, Jessie loses control, and the Hiss infect her mind, stumbling her into a nightmare inside her own head. As she explores this dream world, she sees visions of Ahti, who assists her into discovering that Polaris is actually inside her mind. Upon learning this, she gains the strength to eject the Hiss from her mind, and realises that she's never felt more focused and comfortable than when she was working in her imposed director position. She takes control of her mind, and takes control of her role as director. The events of the game go from her having no control to being in full control. This analysis might be down to heavy bias due to my own experience, but there's almost a mental health angle here. Mentions of therapy and the uses of theories from psychology suggest that Jessie's lack of control may come down to PTSD or some other form of anxiety, and her fighting off the Hiss in the later part of the game inside her own head is her coming to terms with that, learning to control it and push it away. She does this with the help of Polaris, who she loses contact with right before the Hiss take her over, but then she discovers Polaris inside herself. It's actually reminiscent of the process of therapy, where an outside influence helps empower you before letting you go, to allow you to discover that you had the ability to empower yourself inside you the whole time. I mean, Polaris is painted as an entity that opens up pathways, guides and assists and empowers, while on the flip side, the Hiss is a corrupting influence that makes you act outside of the norm and disrupt who you are. It's really not hard to see the parallels of therapy and mental disorder here, and their physical representations contribute too. Polaris is geometric, ordered and fixed, while the Hiss is fluid, chaotic and unsettled. The Hiss creates chaos, while Polaris brings back much needed order. Jessie's journey sees her as uncomfortable, distant and unsure of herself throughout the game, leading to her being calm, self-assured and focused at the very end of the game. Oh, and remember I mentioned Jung earlier? Yeah, Jungian analysis is basically this journey, discovering subconscious elements of yourself to actualize your conscious thought. It actually all comes together quite nicely. Well, that was fun, wasn't it? There were a lot of elements I didn't get to touch on, but I feel this video's gone on long enough, don't you? But ultimately, in all the weirdness of Control, there is a sense of logic, of everything fitting together, and there is a message at the heart of it all. By confronting the strange and the unknown head-on, you will attain powers that you never thought possible to have, and take control of your life in a significant way. Every aspect of Control culminates around this, with a blend of dark humour and genuine dread that few games have pulled off so effectively. And even uncovering all the mysteries we have today, there are still unknowns. Who or what are the board? What is dimensional resonance? And why are there two competing entities that are seemingly made entirely out of it? And why is Hideo Kojima talking about forklifts interrupting tree orgies?
フォークリフトです。この森にはふさわしくありません。巨大なタイヤでビーチが荒らされてしまいます。
A forklift. It does not like the tree's romance.
Anyway, maybe that's the point. We can't know everything, but we can still face the unknown head on, and still be in control. After all, isn't that why we play games in the first place? To control something outside our own reality? Something to consider, I feel. For now though, thank you for joining me in the oldest house. Now go out there and take control yourself. Good night.